Hello, everyone. I'm Demetra Nightingale, and welcome to the Urban Institute's virtual federal evidence workshop. We're really glad to have all of you here today. This session is part of the Urban Institute's ongoing Federal Evidence Forum, which is funded by grants from the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the William T. Grant Foundation. And we have a great panel today, and we're very pleased that today's session is being co-hosted with our colleagues from the Results for America. So we're really happy to be focusing today on capacity assessment, which we know is one of the activities that people are working with today. Before we begin and turn it to the great panel, I just want to go over a few housekeeping bullets on the next slide. The session today is being recorded, and you know, the PowerPoint that I'll be showing you in a minute and the presentations will be made available on our website after. All participants, all of you are muted. You'll be able to type questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time on Zoom. First, before we turn it into the panel, turn it over to Jed Herman, who will introduce and then moderate the panel. I just wanted to give you a few of my thoughts about evidence capacity in general. So we'll go through that. Next slide. First, evidence capacity is really a term that comes out of organizational assessment. And on the next slide, that usually means assessing an organization's staff, its systems, its activities and resources, and it's used to develop plans so that the organization can strengthen the areas that they want to focus on. So on the next slide is the general organizational capacity. I'm going through these very quickly so that we can get to the panel, but you'll have all of the slides available. There's no cookie cutter approach to doing an organizational capacity assessment. The key is that the assessment and the issues and priorities should be tailored to reflect whatever the organizational context is, which means every organization has a different structure, resources, staffing, so there isn't one approach that works. The kinds of tools that have been used, and you'll hear about some of these, would be surveys or focus group discussions with various stakeholders and colleagues. There could be reviews of existing products, reviewing existing research or websites or data systems or documents that might be relevant, or formal organizational studies that might be carried out by an external consultant or a management specialist. There I would say you want to be very careful that whoever's if you do engage someone outside, that it is someone who really understands your agency and mission. The next slide tells you a little bit about how I think of evidence. Evidence really includes performance evaluation, statistical analysis, other kinds of research and analysis, and performance measurement. The capacity assessment is really focused on the green three here: evaluation, statistical, data, and research evaluation. Next slide is federal evidence capacity broadly, if you think about it, not yet talking about OMB, would be conducting a capacity assessment of high caliber activities, and whether or not the functions and the staffing that are available, the resources, are adequate for those key activities. And the contextual factors that I mentioned before, things that you have to think about before doing an assessment or developing evidence activities, is the responsibility at the departmental level or at an agency level or a sub-agency level. What are the resources? Are there resources that can be used for engaging evaluators and data specialists, or does it require collaborative funding across agencies within your department? Are there statutory mandates for evaluation and research? Many laws today require evaluations to be done. And experience with evaluation and research. Does the agency or the office or bureau that you're working with have experience, or are they really starting from scratch? So the key is to use the capacity assessments to build a culture of evidence and learning to ensure that the agency as a whole understands the value of rigorous research in achieving missions. So the next slide is OMB in their requirements lists activities that should be included in the capacity assessment, which is supposed to be done by September of this year. And the focus is on quality, methods, effectiveness, and independence of the various activities, which are on the next slide. And this is just the OMB documents for your reference. We'll skip over to the next slide. Okay, on this slide is practices and standards, which is probably the one that you want to keep in your head a little bit. It's sort of the activities that OMB lists for a capacity assessment. Is it building and maintaining evaluation capacity, using external and expert consultants and evaluators effectively, dissemination, and all of these other activities that are at the top in the left-hand side are things that should be included in the September capacity assessment. On the right-hand side are relevant issues that come from the data strategy framework that also came out from OMB. But the reason that they're important and that I have two columns here is that there's an overlap and a commonality between some of the ethical principles that are in the bottom and standards between the data activities that OMB requires and the principles for evaluation. So the evidence capacity is focused on the top left-hand side and those particular categories. Next slide. I know I've gone through this really quickly, but my summary points that I hope you'll bear in mind as you're listening to the panel and also doing your own assessments is that the purpose of an evidence capacity assessment is to strengthen your institutional practices around evaluation, statistics, research, and analysis. And the ultimate objective is to build an evidence-based culture in the organization. OMB guidance calls for the interim assessment in 2020, but I would say that this is an opportunity now to consider how to strengthen your evidence approaches, not just to meet the OMB requirements. Second is that there's no single way or single template or framework for conducting an assessment, and that as you're doing it, tailor what's appropriate for your particular organization. And you'll hear some great examples in a minute. And finally, not all of the practices necessarily have to be assessed all at once. For the September capacity assessment, I would say, think about this as a first phase and gauge your progress afterwards. So you might want to begin with a few of the activities that were on the previous slide and think about moving forward. So depending on where you are on the developmental stage in terms of maturity, if you've never done evidence and evaluation before, you might want to start off small. If you're a very sophisticated evaluation office, you may be able to improve and perfect some of the strategies that you already have. I know I went through that very quickly, but you will have the PowerPoint, and I'm happy to talk to any of you at any time later. My contact information is on the next slide there. Without further time on my end, I want to just turn the podium over to Jed Herman from the Results for America, who will moderate our great panel. And again, he'll tell you how to get your Q&As in, but we do want to hear any questions and comments you might have. Jed.
Great, Demetra, thank you so much. I'm sure that many of our participants today are going to be calling you up and asking for ideas to have how to do the capacity assessment. I bet some might even try to convince you to have you do it for them, given your expertise. So thanks for that great overview, and thanks for hosting today on behalf of Results for America. It's a pleasure to do this with you and talk about how federal agencies can assess their research, evaluation, statistical, and analysis capacity. Before we start, I want to thank you, Demetra, for hosting this, and also the Urban Institute for partnering with Results for America to host this event. And a special thanks to the Urban Institute team, including Ivy, Batya, and Molly, who are working behind the scenes to make this happen. Just for some opening context before I introduce our panel, I think Demetra noted very smartly that capacity assessment is really just a tool towards building a culture of evidence and continuous improvement that can lead to improved outcomes and improved fulfillment of mission. And I would say at Results for America, we've really seen how assessing capacity is a first step towards growing that capacity and ultimately putting that capacity to work to improve results. So for example, we've been tracking how agencies are using evidence and data since 2013 in our annual Federal Standard of Excellence. As background, this Federal Standard of Excellence scores 10 federal agencies and how they're using data, evaluation, and evidence to improve results. And so I think we've seen with these 10 overarching criteria that we have in this Federal Standard of Excellence and 41 individual sub-criteria, that it really provides a pretty good sense of agency capacity. So based on this, I feel pretty qualified today to tell you that when agencies are improving their capacity to use evidence and data and evaluation statistics, that really does lead to improved operations and better outcomes. We've seen that over the years. And two of our panelists today, who will join us in a second, participate in our Federal Standard of Excellence and have some information, some examples on how they have done that over the years, improved their capacity and what the results have been. But it also gives us a good window, the Federal Standard of Excellence, into overall how is the federal government doing on using evidence and data. And I think there's been a tremendous growth over these past 7 years that we've been tracking it, and much longer time than many of you and Demetra and others have been doing this. And I think the Evidence Act really marks a new chapter in this federal evidence work by taking many things that were simply best practices and making them required. The good news, I think, is that OMB has taken a very thoughtful approach and avoided laying out a check-the-box or cookie-cutter approach to the requirements of the Evidence Act. And this flexible approach, I think, is validated by the differences we've seen in our Federal Standard of Excellence for how different agencies require different approaches to building and using evidence. For example, the evaluation plan at the Corporation for National Community Service, which provides many small grants directly to national service organizations, looks very different than the evaluation plan at the U.S. Department of Labor, which gives out big chunks of formula funds in many cases. And so a capacity assessment for those two organizations should also look very different. But one of the reasons we're here today is this flexibility in terms of what a capacity assessment looks like also creates a challenge to design capacity assessments in a way that correspond to an agency's mission and their overall organizational structure. So we're going to explore today in our panel conversation, both with some folks inside of federal government and some folks with experience outside of federal government working with organizations to assess and improve their capacity. What are some approaches we can take? So we'll start with a panel discussion. I'll introduce our panelists in a moment, and then we'll move into a Q&A session. And as Demetra mentioned, during the Q&A session, you can just type questions in the Q&A box on the side of your screen. You can activate that by clicking the icon on the bottom of the screen. You can feel free to send those questions in at any time. We'll be compiling them, and later Molly Scott from the Urban Institute will be packaging them and delivering them to us to discuss with the panel. So you can feel free to ask those at any time. And so without any further ado, let me introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce them. I'll have them say a brief word about their work, and then we'll circle back and answer them some more questions. So I'm going to start with Christina Yancey, who's the Chief Evaluation Officer at the U.S. Department of Labor, which, as Demetra knows, is certainly one of the longtime leaders in federal evaluation work. And beyond her considerable evaluation skill sets, Christina also has an excellent strategic mindset, which I think she'll bring to this conversation today, and a good sense of humor, which makes her a pleasure to have here today. So Christina, it'd be great if you could just introduce yourself and share some very brief framing thoughts or context you'd like folks to know for our conversation today. Christina?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Christina Yancey. I'm the Chief Evaluation Officer at the U.S. Department of Labor. And the Chief Evaluation Officer at the Department of Labor is responsible for overseeing and implementing and managing the evaluation program for the department, which means that we work with all of the sub-agencies to develop and implement evaluations as well as other rigorous research activities. And we primarily do that through procurements with independent third-party contractors to do a variety of rigorous activities such as, randomized controlled trials, which is often what people classically think about in terms of evaluation work, but we do a lot of other really important rigorous work that is, also, I think, as we'll discuss more with the capacity assessment, is part of the scope of the work of capacity assessments, which is to look at the capacity to develop evidence syntheses and to conduct feasibility assessments and analysis, to scan the literature, to appreciate the implementation of different program models, and to conduct administrative analysis of your existing data. So I think it's important always to remember that under this kind of umbrella of the capacity assessment, looking at research and analysis, that it's helpful to always keep into perspective the range of activities that we undertake. So our office, the Chief Evaluation Office, is responsible for overseeing many aspects and coordinating many of the aspects of the Evidence Act requirements, which obviously includes the capacity assessments. And while some of the requirements for the Evidence Act are familiar to my office, and as Demetra well knows, having overseen that office and implementing this, I think, a really stellar process for developing and generating new learning ideas through the Learning Agenda process, which is now codified in the new Act. There are other elements of the Evidence Act which are also new to us, which include capacity assessments. So I think, in our conversation today, I'll share some ideas about things that we're planning to do and undertaking. But again, as Demetra mentioned, this is definitely going to be an iterative process, not just in terms of potentially tweaking how we format the document and think about doing this going forward, but also the process of engaging our stakeholders will continue to evolve as we want to make this a product that's meaningful as well as meeting the statutory requirements. So I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks, Christina. Thanks for that overview of your work at the Department of Labor. Next, I want to introduce Susan Jenkins, who's the Director of the Office of Performance and Evaluation at the Administration for Community Living within the Department of Health and Human Services. Not only has Susan been ratcheting up ACL's evaluation work over the past several years, she's been doing similar work across HHS by serving on the department's data council and throughout the government through a recent detail she had at the Office of Management and Budget. So all this gives Susan multiple perspectives on the issues related to evaluation and data capacity, which will add a lot to our conversation today. So Susan, could you introduce yourself and give any brief framing thoughts for our conversation today?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. As Jed said, I'm the Director of the Office of Performance and Evaluation for the Administration for Community Living, which is an operating division within HHS. And it will be interesting to talk some today about what HHS is doing as a large agency, a large department that has a lot of operating and staff divisions that do a lot of different things, are different sizes, have different focus. And so how we think about an capacity assessment really is interesting and different and has to account for all of those differences among the operating and staff divisions. But at ACL specifically, I will be responsible for administering the capacity assessment. And some of the things that we've been doing lately to help to build our capacity and our ability to work with evidence more generally is developing an ACL Data Council, which is a data governance body, which is also doing some smaller capacity assessments in some areas that are specific to ACL. So that will roll into the HHS capacity assessment that we have to participate in. And I think as we think about capacity assessments, and I have thought about it a lot through my detail with OMB and my work in HHS, is that it really is an iterative process. As Demetra said, we have to start somewhere, and this interim capacity assessment that many of us are or will be soon working on is a good starting place. We have to pick and choose what we may focus on, how deeply we may delve into certain areas, what our priorities are, but it really is an iterative process, and it's a good starting place to ultimately figure out what is our capacity, where should we focus on building that capacity, so that in the end, we do have stronger government evidence to know what we're doing, how we're doing, and what it's providing to the United States, to the people that live here, to our constituents, to our stakeholders, things like that. So I'm excited to talk about this today.
Great, thanks, Susan. And thanks for bringing us back to the point of all this, which is to help people. So really appreciate that and enjoy hearing your remarks always, and look forward to more in a moment. Finally, let me introduce Kelly Fitzsimmons, who's the founder and managing director of Project Evident. Kelly's national leadership on the role of evidence in delivering better results, as well as her hands-on experience helping organizations of all kinds build their evaluation capacity, allow her to share with us the broader perspective on why and how capacity assessments more generally can deliver benefits to organizations and allow them to better achieve their mission. So Kelly, pleasure to have you here today. Could you just introduce yourself briefly and share any framing thoughts before we start our conversation?
Great, thank you, Jed, and hello everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation today, and delighted with the topic of evidence. I think it's one that's kind of near and dear to our hearts, and the work of capacity assessments, helping organizations to be at their best, do their best to deliver strongest possible outcomes is one that we are completely committed to at Project Evident. As we work with a variety of nonprofits, funders, state, local governments, school districts, who quite frankly are all wrestling with various aspects of the evidence building challenges of the capacity assessments that they need to undertake and capacities that they need to build. And although the bulk of our experience has been outside of federal government, I think there's some very pertinent lessons as we all together look at ways to improve our evidence building, improve the capacity for delivering stronger outcomes for communities and citizens, and be much more systematic and rigorous in this work. So looking forward to the panel.
Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate you bringing that perspective today. Let's just dive in on some of the questions here. Christina, I'm going to start with you because you're a member of the Interagency Evaluation Officers Council. So can you summarize for us, just to sort of set the scene here, what are a couple of the challenges you've heard from agencies about the capacity assessment, and what are some of your thoughts on ways to address those challenges?
Sure. So the capacity assessment, I think, suffers from a similar challenge that many of the other requirements in the Evidence Act do, which is that the Evidence Act is a broad, ambitious sort of mandate, and it is, like many really compelling mandates, unfunded. And so we hear from the agencies that this is something that's important and valuable, but at the same time that it is necessarily requiring to offset resources and time and attention from other areas that the agencies have. So there's, ironically, to conduct a capacity assessment, agencies argue they don't have the capacity to do the capacity assessment because there's just a tension given the fact that there's challenges with funding. So that, I think that obviously it always looms when there's a lot of requirements, and the capacity assessment fits into this challenge the way the other requirements are in the Evidence Act. I think secondly, there's concern about this being a compliance exercise and or that it is a audit. So there's alternatively concern, so it's sort of like two sides of the same coin. One is that if we may just get sort of rote responses, that there's not going to be a lot of meaningful content, and the ergo these documents, which have a lot of, I think, are generated from a good space to be able to develop ways to have conversations to enhance continuous learning and improvement across the agencies, that there will not be a focus on giving meaningful response, but instead to be more compliance driven, and also because of this concern about it being a way to expose issues. So I think at a high level, those are, I think, the biggest areas of challenge for the Evidence Act to bring meaning and to get support for some of these activities. I do think that there's, because of these as being, I think, predictable challenges, those of us that are professionals in this space appreciate that this is often a struggle for us, and so we also have to go back to some key first principles in terms of how we talk about this work. So I think a first part is to consider multiple angles of framing. So with the capacity assessment, there are always going to be stakeholders that see this as a compliance exercise. The goal isn't to change their minds. It is to seek out the champions who do see the underlying meaning. And one of the things that's great about the OMB guidance and the OMB messaging so far is about creating flexibility within the requirements, focusing on the fact that at a department level, we have to put together a document that describes ways that we are assessing capacity, but within those requirements at the sub-agency level, we can focus within certain sub-agencies on certain aspects, for example. So I think when you have sub-agencies that are really eager and wanting to jump on board and kind of dive deep and learn more, you can go lean into those stakeholders and those groups, because what ends up happening is that those particular spaces and pockets where folks are open to innovation, open to the process as being a compelling place to identify ways to target and reinvest future resources, that you can create pilots and you can create proof of concepts. These types of small wins are really critical when you have a big requirement. So I think that is something that all of us should kind of take heart in, is the fact that small wins, they do snowball and you do create culture change that way. So that's something I think overall that's really helpful. The other thing is that I think that's really helpful with the capacity assessment is that the document that's due in September is an interim capacity assessment, and that serves as a great place to sort of pilot the approach, learn from that, and then iterate already in this early stage, so that when we put together the full 4-year capacity assessment, we've already gained some early learnings. I also think that because all of the agencies are doing this, and for many, this is their first time doing it, and we're all taking different approaches to how we're doing the interim capacity assessments, there's going to be a lot of learnings that we will be able to share, even informally, amongst each other to sort of help build this capacity to do this work across the different agencies.
Great, thank you, Christina. That's a very good overview and sort of identifying the two main concerns of the unfunded mandate and having it be a compliance exercise in some ways to address that. I think it's a very smart approach. Susan or Kelly, do you want to jump in for a quick minute on your thoughts on either of those before we move on to the next question?
No, I think you all saw me shaking my head in agreement, so that's what I have to say about that.
And maybe a plus one on sort of Christina's comments that seeing this work as compliance is actually a systemic issue in our nation. And so the more that the more we have better use cases to lift up the snowballing of those quick wins, it actually extends beyond the federal government. It extends to sort of the far corners of where this, where we want to see this work mainstream, essentially, and sort of be an everyday part of what we do when we're about strengthening the use of evidence for communities. So it's not a lone issue. It's a larger one to tackle, but it's very much shared, I think, across sectors.
Great, that's helpful, Kelly. That leads actually to a question I have for you, which is, you're working with a really broad array of organizations, as you laid out at the top: state, local, federal, nonprofit, government, and others, to help them improve their evidence-based decision-making. And so you're really thinking to this question about how to assess and strengthen capacity for data and evidence generating and also for use. And so just for context here, why is a capacity assessment a useful tool for all kinds of organizations? And how have you seen some kinds of organizations use this capacity assessment process to strengthen their decision-making and to improve results? Any specific examples you can give would be great.
Sure, great. And I would also add that a big part of the motivation for starting Project Evident came out of very positive experiences with the federal government, and recognizing there was sort of more we needed to do outside to sort of connect players in the ecosystem. But I think for us in our experience, again, across a broader set of groups, is, good, rigorous capacity assessments are vitally important. They help organizations, teams, entities really get a clear understanding of what goals are they trying to achieve, what their starting point is, what gaps might exist that get in the way of achieving those goals, and then establish a clear, relevant roadmap towards achieving those evidence goals. And sort of, as Demetra said earlier, it's not about doing everything all at once. It's about being stepwise and thoughtful, and seeing this as building assets, building strength. we really see the importance of capacity assessments across multiple dimensions. And a major one is that it ultimately strengthens evidence-based decision-making. Evidence is a means, it's ultimately the decisions we make with the data and evidence that we have. And so how do we get better and stronger at that? What capacities do we need to build? And we need to help leaders and managers understand what capacities they actually really have. Sometimes they're often overlooked or hidden, from everything from data systems to within programmatic models, and then what gaps can be filled or ways to really strengthen and lift those assets up. And quite frankly, capacity assessments are exercise or approaches that anybody at any stage can engage in. It is staged. We think about this as maturity. It's not just for certain groups. There's something in it for everyone. And we know from the evidence base, the evidence on evidence, that good technical assistance to assist with capacity building for the building and use of evidence actually has strong positive results. When needs assessments are done well, when process evaluations are done well and are connected, those capacity building activities are connected to those and are run on a systematic basis, we actually get stronger outcomes. So the evidence tells us this is a good thing to do, supporting a lot of the comments that were shared earlier. And I'll share two quick examples, one from a nonprofit and one from a school district. Center for Employment Opportunities had a goal of improving their long-term employment outcomes. But they really we're starting with looking deep at their own capabilities and what they needed to do with the infrastructure that they had to meet that goal. And so the capacity assessment ultimately let them optimize their own data collection tools, analysis, strengthen their data visualization, and make investments in the places that they needed to, including adding staff, so that their ultimate ability to test their own assumptions, make the appropriate improvements on their own, empowered to do so, reallocating resources accordingly, and make their reporting more user-friendly, more useful for the stakeholders that they needed to share information with or share in decision-making with, ultimately improving service delivery. And then being able to retest some of these improvements and in fact see positive gains on the very problem that they were seeking to tackle, which was one of lifted stronger outcomes on longer-term employment. So it did ultimately result in hiring some different additional staff who brought new competencies in. But more excitingly, I think for CEO, it also let their current team develop stronger learning muscle themselves, and people were re-inspired and motivated with the work that they were doing. So we really saw it playing to individual learning edge and deeper satisfaction with the work as opposed to being stuck with the problem. With regard to Baltimore, they reached out because they were really struggling with in their Office of Career and College Readiness, their CTE programs, their career technical education programs, by their own assessment, were not that good, and they wanted to do better. So by engaging with them, looking at, okay, if that's the goal, what capacities do you have to in fact improve? We worked with them to help them use existing BCPS student, teacher, school, and facilities data. So bring together different data sets they already had. So it didn't cost them anything. It was just bring them together in a different way. Really understand what the real student and employer interests were in that context to better match teachers, coursework, internship opportunities, and really work to improve the educational outcomes that resulted from that. Being able to map those data sets together, that's a really low cost intervention. It's more of a matter of the capacity to do that and learn how to do that to then make better decisions about where to allocate those resources. And in this particular instance, it actually resulted in a $600,000 savings for them, which was a significant portion of their program, while they were able to get better designed programs for their students and benefit the school district as well as local employers. So capacity building makes a tremendous difference.
That's great, Kelly. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I think it really emphasizes the dividends that a capacity assessment can play, both in terms of sort of technical abilities, staff engagement in the work and mission of the organization, and how sometimes that leads to small changes as well as larger changes. And that can be cost savings or an additional ability to achieve the mission. So that's really great. And I'm going to go to Susan now. To pick up on this point, because you have been working, Kelly, I think gave us a good broad perspective on inside and outside of government. You've been working a lot within HHS and broadly across government, as you mentioned on this. So can you tell us a little about how you see and what you've been doing to help agencies assess their capacity? What's your perspective on some of the opportunities here of this capacity assessment, and how can we address some of the challenges that Christina laid out before, or other challenges you've identified?
Sure. So in addition to doing these kinds of trainings and working with OMB in various different capacities through my detail and on some subcommittees that I've remained on since my detail ended, the main focus that I've had is working within HHS. HHS has an evidence and evaluation council that has members from each of the operating and staff divisions that works on these types of issues. And this council was stood up years ago for a variety of issues related to coordinating, consolidating, improving evaluation across HHS. So as the Evidence Act was passed, we had been watching it, looking at it, trying to see, okay, what is this really going to be once it becomes law? So when it was, we were able to quickly talk about as a council what we wanted to do, how we wanted to do it, and we set up a number of subcommittees. The capacity assessment, focusing on that, was one of the subcommittees. So I'm on that particular subcommittee. We started meeting in November of 2019. And we laid out an approach for both developing the capacity assessment as a data collection tool and an approach for collecting the actual information. And so in terms of tool development, we decided to focus on the language of the OMB memo M1923, which Demetra mentioned in her early remarks, as a way to frame the scope for the information collection, because there are a lot of different things that we could look at, a lot of different ways we could approach it, but to make sure that we were covering what we thought of as the important areas and what we thought OMB was saying were the important areas for the capacity assessment, we focused on memo M1923 for our topics. And so we decided on a survey with mostly closed-ended questions that would be followed with interviews as needed to either clarify or expand various different of the survey responses. And we requested that committee members provide possible tools that we could look at and adapt, as opposed to coming up with questions on our own from scratch. And we ended up with 7 tools from large federal agencies such as CDC, GAO, NIH, as well as large nonprofits. And each subcommittee mapped the questions from those existing tools to the topics that we had identified from the OMB memo. And we ended up with a large, what I call Frankenstein-like document that had a lot of different questions that we could ask related to any of the various different topics. So then we had a subcommittee work on winnowing down the questions, getting rid of duplication, getting rid of questions that maybe weren't as priority, because we do have limited time and ability to ask these questions of people. And we also took into account whether the question got at a concept that could actually be addressed and improved, because that's important with capacity assessment, measuring things that we actually can address and improve in terms of our capacity. So we're currently at the stage of finalizing the draft tool. It's being looked at by the entire Evaluation and Evidence Council, and we will be administering it soon. And so there are questions in it. It's about 25 questions, and there are questions about each of the organization within HHS's environment, such as whether there's a centralized evaluation focus or a decentralized focus, the structure in terms of policies, procedures related to developing good evidence, staff capacity, the use of evidence in decision making. Is it encouraged? Is it done? How often is it done? That kind of thing. Some questions about dissemination and accessibility of data and reports and results, things like that. questions about data systems in order to access, look at, and analyze the various different sources of evidence. And there are some open-ended questions that we will use the information to have more examples of really what we can focus on for our capacity building plan. And so the goal, as I said, is to administer this throughout the department. Each operating and staff division will be able to respond to it, and then we will use that information to compile the report. So when we think about challenges and opportunities for the capacity assessment, I'm going to say echo somewhat what people have already said. But in my experience with HHS and in talking with staff from other agencies, the challenges include both getting our arms around the idea of accurately assessing data and evidence building capacity across departments that may be large, they may have uneven capacity, uneven interest in doing something like this, and pulling that information into a coherent finding that then at the department level we can report back to OMB, and that we can use to improve our capacity. How do we do that? So that was one of the big challenges. And then another one is resources. So everything that Christina said about resources, I think, is absolutely true. And it's hard to get support for something like this at the best of times, but particularly with the pandemic, it seems like it's very, very hard to get resources, be it interest, be it people, be it time, any of that kind of stuff. But I do think, and I've talked to others who think that there are a lot of opportunities here also. And so one of the opportunities that we may not be able to measure directly really is raising the conversation about the importance of strengthening our capacity, knowing what our capacity is, that it's important to know what it is, and then what can we really do about it. So just bringing up that conversation, I think, moves us forward. And in my view, we can't really move forward toward higher quality capacity, higher quality evidence if we don't know where we actually are at this time. If we don't know what we're capable of now, we can't have a coherent, reasonable plan for building capacity. And without something like that, we're not going to get the resources to do it. And so not saying that we have the resources now, but if we can't show a coherent plan that builds and includes various different stakeholders, we won't get that buy-in that we're going to need to be able to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, Susan, that's a great point. I think all of us know from our work on evaluation or performance management or statistics, you want to know what your baseline rate is. And so it's very hard to make decisions if you don't have that in hand. So I think that really highlights the need for the capacity assessment. I want to pull out sort of two strands you had there. One was sort of on specific tools and some of the approaches you're taking. So I want to come back to that and have Kelly talk a little about that and how Project Evident does some of that work and some of the specific tools they use. But you also talked about interagency or intra-agency coordination, how you're coordinating within your agency. So I want to go to Christina on that first. DOL, as you said, is you're serving both on the interagency council, you're coordinating this work among agencies at DOL. And so tell us a little about coordinating these activities across an agency, what approaches, structures you've used at DOL that can sort of effectively bring together these internal stakeholders, staff from across the agency, both policy and operational staff that are all in the end working together to try to deliver on the mission of the Department of Labor. How do you bring them together to assess the agency's overall capacity and then work together towards designing a plan to build that capacity?
Right. So you do know we are in the first year of doing this. so we shall talk more again in about a year to see a full, robust answer to your question. But what I can start with, though, is just offering, based on our learning agenda experience, that we have modeled some of our activities so far based on, I think, some of those practices which we have found to be really helpful dealing with our partnering with our sub-agencies, which is that this is a departmental level requirement, right, to satisfy this capacity assessment. But each of our sub-agencies are in their own universe in terms of their maturity models. There isn't a monolithic Department of Labor capacity maturity that we all sort of align to and exist under. Instead, each of the sub-agencies has their own unique space and time, not only in terms of a maturity model along all of the dimensions, but within each of the different capacities and strengths and weaknesses that they have, they're different. So one of the lessons that we've learned is to approach each of the sub-agencies somewhat uniquely. And one of the key critical, I think, points of the interface is related to whether or not your sub-agencies have their own sort of centralized evidence and evaluation building office, or even just person, even if it's just a single person in that sub-agency that appreciates their landscape. That is really critical, because then that particular unit or person can help identify and support that work in that sub-agency in a meaningful way. And if the sub-agency lacks that, then there's a different role that my office plays. So I feel like in terms of structure, it's really important to make sure that that you don't sort of overly whitewash the fact that that what we're doing isn't really summing a total, but instead there's pockets across that have to be highlighted and discussed, and that you can't look at an average effect. This is not about the average situation. It's more about really making sure that there's nuance and that you're lifting up particular strengths or challenges, but that you're not doing it in a way that then makes it not meaningful for anyone, because it doesn't specifically have utility for any given unit, if that makes sense. So I think that's one of the things we've learned, is to really have our overarching sort of plan and what we need to get our inputs for, but then recognizing that there is no standard template, for example, that is universal for all of the sub-agencies. Though I would also offer this, Susan, coming off of your experience, it will be very interesting to hear if you find that this survey that you're undertaking is something that you can find that there's some consistency across your sub-agencies. Again, this is somewhere where we're all learning, and we will be really interested to hear how this survey administration goes. So I wanted to put a plug in for that we're excited stakeholders in hearing how that turns out. The other thing I would also like to mention is that something that we want to make sure happens is that the capacity assessment it naturally feeds into other documents that are being developed. And what I mean by this is that that we do not want to produce a capacity assessment that has findings that don't have a place to land. So we would like to make connections to the strategic plan, to the future evidence building plan, that these create a virtuous cycle particularly for those that are interested in just the compliance aspect of the capacity assessment, that we can communicate that doing the capacity assessment isn't just an end to a means in itself, but that it is data that you are then going to be able to use and leverage for other requirements. So, we describe these as bookends, that the capacity assessment helps bookend the prior evidence building plan, that they're related to each other, and that the results of the capacity assessment will help identify areas that we will focus on for evidence building in the future. So I think that it's important to think of this as a cycle, and that you have natural connections that are looped into each other.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Christina. And actually, that brings me, that's a perfect segue to the question I wanted to pull out from Kelly a little bit on what some of the tools are and how this is a sort of a continuous improvement cycle, right? It's iterative, and this is going to happen over a series of years, both within organizations generally and also as part of this capacity assessment work. Before I do that, I want to mention two quick things. One is I'm going to ask Kelly a question, and then Susan a last question, then we're going to go to Q&A. So if folks have Q&A, you can feel free to write it now in the Q&A box, and we'll gather up those questions. So when we turn to the Q&A part, we'll be able to ask those. And then Susan, you mentioned the surveys you're doing at HHS. Not to put you on the spot, you can defer, but as Christina mentioned, I think other agencies would be very interested to see either the results of that survey or a copy of the survey itself as something they could learn from. Is that something you think could be made available at some point?
Absolutely. What I can make available to now, if people want to email me, are the 7 documents that we used for developing our survey. And once we finalize, and we should finalize it in the next week or so, our survey, going to HHS's evaluation officer, that would be the best place to actually get a copy of that survey.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And with that, so I want to go back to this other thread we had before about some of the specific tools that agencies can use, and go to you, Kelly, because Project Evan has a really structured and thoughtful approach to assessing an organization's capacity in the areas of evaluation and data and analysis. So what are some of the key aspects of that process? And what do you think some of the specific components that lead to better results in the end that we should make sure people on this webinar today are learning about?
Sure, and thanks, Jed. And I think both points that Christina and Susan sort of made prior there's a lot of alignment, a lot of resonance. But we have developed an approach we call strategic evidence planning that does include these deep assessments. We call it a SEP for short, and we have an overview document. I can send that along if that's useful. It just kind of goes into a little bit more detail about all, the pieces that are included in this tool. But for us, the importance of really thinking holistically over time and iteratively with regard to these kind of the components that go in to building capacity for evidence building and use serve the purpose of really opening up the black box in many ways. And so the comment about the starting point sort of earlier is, it's important to get grounded in that as Susan was saying, but it's also important to get off the back foot, if you were, as people are kind of coming into this work. So we're seeing within the strategic evidence planning process, our sort of the second, big step is context and capacity reviews. And those that assessment process looks at key evidence, key aspects of an organization's evidence building capacities. We believe that strengthening these capacities result in more inclusive and actionable evidence generation, which I think a lot of people are looking right now for more relevant evidence generation and use. So this is important and timely. But this also means that in addition to seeking opportunities to build evidence that's more timely, that it's really grounded in practical needs and questions. So the questions of today, as not instead of the questions of tomorrow, but sort of both and that really gets to more of the iterative over time piece. That the work is inclusive and it's not biased, that it's, sort of rigorously checked on, for these components, that it's contextually relevant for the agency, for the domain of consideration, other pressures, other policy considerations, and that it's cost effective. Because we know that we can't waste time or money really, pushing forward for this work. So for us, the major dimensions in these assessments include, and I think Christina hit on some of these points too. Really looking hard at what evidence is needed and how it can be generated in support of the strategic plan or the larger strategic priorities that are imminent of consideration and need to really govern the setup. And looking at how strengthening those capacities connect to operating and other plans so they're not occurring in a silo, and that's critically important. We're looking hard at data systems and tools in these assessments to understand really what is the technological capacity and the data infrastructure. Is it right? Is it even, will it even allow for the analysis to be run that is required to meet the goals? And allow for the appropriate measurement and evaluation also that needs to occur. Do we have the right tools in place to reduce burden on staff? Are there ways to maybe rethink that or choose some different options that really increases the human ability to collect, analyze, and visualize data appropriately? We look hard at the internal evidence base. What data already exists that the entity, the organization, the agency's program has? Is it being fully leveraged? Is it being fully optimized? Do we actually have data assets that we might not realize that we have that can, move us further faster? Sometimes data also exists in silos in organizations or agencies, and do we need to break some of those down and strengthen the feedback loops or the data linkage or uses across? I think the Baltimore example I shared earlier speaks to that. And the connection to the external evidence base is also critically important, that we're bringing that in and connecting both internal and external evidence for really supporting these capacity considerations. And then finally, I think as mentioned before, the all important critical element of organizational culture. Do we have the right attitudes, practices, and competencies across the team to pursue the evidence agenda that we're setting out for ourselves? Do we need to work on shifts towards more of a learning mindset from a compliance mindset? Are we using data on a systemic basis to drive decision making? And are there opportunities to see greater alignment from maybe diverse stakeholders that haven't been so involved in this work to date, but turns out they might be crucial for helping to move the work forward? So those are the major dimensions. I know that's kind of a quick run through, but I hope that sort of gives the sense of what we're really seeing as the critical essential when it comes to this work.
That's great, Kelly. Thank you very much. And good to pick up on the theme of stakeholder engagement, especially groups that have been represented. I know, circling back to the previous Urban Evidence Forum, that's what the topic was, of engaging stakeholders on learning agenda. So a nice full circle there on this topic. I want to go to Susan with the last question before we go to Q&A. And it really brings back to the heart of this, I think, Kelly, what you and Christina and Susan herself identified of, this really being about trying to improve results and looking at areas where you can actually make improvements, right, where it's possible to do that. And so, Susan, the Evidence Act requires this capacity assessment to be about coverage and quality and methods and effectiveness and independence of the agency's work. But I think when you really look at it, like the effectiveness part is really at the heart of that, right? How are we being effective? All those things are around us being able to do our work better and get better results. So how do you think an analysis of coverage, quality, methods, and independence can support this focus on improving, in the end, the effectiveness, Susan?
Sure, and I'll be brief so that we do have time for questions and answers. But I think as we think about effectiveness, the Evidence Act actually reminds us to base that thinking on credible evidence. Anecdotes about effectiveness are not sufficient. And so for evidence of effectiveness to be credible, it has to be at the right level of coverage. We have to look at our agencies, our departments, as a whole to the extent that we can, or be very clear about the pieces that we're looking at, and not just focus on a few programs or offices. The information has to be of sufficient quality that we can be confident that any conclusions that we draw are sound. We have to use sound methods, and that touches on quality in terms of the rigor of those methods, but methods is also broader. We need those methods to be appropriate, and people have mentioned that earlier. Randomized control trial designs are the gold standard in some way, but they're not always the best method for a particular question, a particular office, a particular program. So they have to be appropriate to the program being studied and the intended use of the data that's being gathered. And when we think about independence, which is in that question, OMB Memorandum 2012 says it well, I think, that federal evaluations must be viewed as objective in order for stakeholders, experts, and the public to accept their findings. This depends on the independence and objectivity of evaluators. Evaluators should strive for objectivity in the planning, conduct of evaluations, and interpretation and dissemination. And so our effectiveness is only as good as the evidence that we have to support it, and that evidence requires coverage, it requires independence, rigor, methods, all of those different things. And I'd like to just close with, I think it's a balancing act, and I think that we've all said that today, that when we think about those different elements that you mentioned, Jed, we want coverage, but we may not have resources to do all that we want. Do we want to be a mile wide and an inch deep? Do we want to be the opposite? Do we have resources for some priority items now, and we may have more resources to have broader coverage in the future? We have to balance methods to find, again, the ones that are appropriate to our context. And looking at the OMB maturity model, which was developed as part of the process of operationalizing the Evidence Act, it's one way of starting to think about that balance, because it shows multiple dimensions related to evidence, evidence building, evidence culture, learning cultures, things like that. And it shows that an agency can be strong in some areas and weak in other areas. And so it does start to show that capacity is not one single thing, and there's not one single rating. And I believe Christina said that. A whole agency may not be high, medium, or low. There may be a lot of bright points and a lot of dark points across the agency. And so we really, I think, need to think of it as iterative and think of capacity assessment and capacity building as a balancing act.
That's great, Susan, and that's a great close, I think, to our panel discussion here. I want to turn to Q&A. I think you brought up some very important points about why we're doing this in the first place, right? Why it's great to have a flexible structure so that agencies can think about how to adapt it to their particular situation, why it's important to do a capacity assessment so that we can understand and make specific and explicit choices about how we're spending our resources and what we're going to get for that and what the trade-offs are. And not only that folks on the panel or folks in the audience, they can understand that, but the senior executives with their agencies and people in Congress and people in OMB and the White House can understand what those choices are as well. And that starts with being able to understand what the capacity is and then what trade-offs we'll have to make if we want to increase effectiveness and make progress. So with that, I really want to, hopefully this has been helpful and interesting. I certainly have gotten a lot of good tips and ideas on both how to frame this conceptually as well as some specific tools to use, both inside the government and what's being effective outside the government with other organizations. But the purpose of today is to make it useful for you all that are listening. So now's your chance. If we've really blown it and asked all the wrong questions and you've got something that's really burning that you want to ask, it's your chance to do it. So we're going to go to Q&A. Again, you can do that using the Q&A box, which you can activate with the icon on the bottom of your screen. To do the Q&A, I'm going to introduce Molly Scott from the Urban Institute. She's got really a deep background in program evaluation and evidence-based policy, and so she's a real expert. So it's going to be wonderful to have her help manage these questions from the audience. She's going to take them in, combine any ones that are similar, and deliver them back to us, and then I'll moderate a conversation with our panelists in response to that question. So Molly, let me turn it over to you for our first question.
Sure. Thanks so much for that, Jed, and good afternoon, everyone. We've already gotten a lot of really great questions in. I'm going to start off with the first one that has to do with understanding who within an agency is the right person, or which team is the right person to undertake an evidence capacity assessment, and how should we think about the overlap between those folks and the ones who are working on annual reporting for GIPRA or strategic planning. Any thoughts about that, particularly the folks who are in federal government?
Who wants to take that first? Susan?
Yeah. So I don't have a definitive answer for that. It will depend on the particular agency, of course, but I think one of the ideas under the Evidence Act and what OMB is putting forward in terms of guidance is that there should be a team that do these types of things. And so the evaluation officer, I think, is tasked with doing the capacity assessment, but not by him or herself. That the evaluation officer should work with the chief data officer, should work with the statistical official as available as needed, and to find out who in the agency is doing these types of things. Are there particular bureaus or organizations, operating divisions as it were, that may have strong knowledge of what's going on in the field and on the ground, and bring those folks together and develop a committee. And I would say with HHS, with the Evidence and Evaluation Council, we did have representation from all of the operating divisions, and we did have support of the evaluation officer and other key people to do it. And I think it really is a team approach. And so no one team, but the folks that are involved with this type of operation in an agency would be the right people, at least to start with. And that would be a good starting place.
Christina, did you want to weigh in?
Sorry, I wanted to weigh in on that too, because I wanted to reinforce with Susan's point about this idea of having a sort of cross-discipline team in your department. So in the Department of Labor, after the Evidence Act was passed, we, the chief sort of evidence officials in the Department of Labor, chief performance improvement officer or deputy, the statistical official, the chief data officer, and myself have collectively met and talked about some of these requirements. So I think that's something that's also really helpful, because as I would imagine exists in the other agencies the way it does in ours, the performance and evaluation function, for example, sit in different offices, and within the sub-agencies, the people who directly give inputs to us for the learning agendas and the evaluation plan are not the same folks that handle the GIPRA MA requirements or the performance requirements. So you'll often find that these groups require a place to come together to talk about the general issues so that you can create a just even a way, a communication channel, because that to me is the beginning of developing sort of robust integrated documents is convening some cross-functional groups.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
I'll just add one thought here, Molly, before we go to our next question, which is,
Yeah.
I think, through our federal standard of excellence, we look at a variety of agencies. And I think last year, particularly, and this year as well, looking at, since the Evidence Act has passed, the cross-agency bodies that agencies have assembled to really have that coordination, elevate the role of evaluation and data and evidence as learning tools to help improve the agency. I think it's really given some wind in the sails to folks to be able to have that coordination to the ultimate end of improving policy and operational and evidence, all those components. So it's a great question.
To sort of piggyback off that, Jed, I think Christina, you were talking about the importance of having strong training and technical assistance for folks and agencies that are trying to do these evidence assessments. Do you have suggestions or insights where agencies can get that kind of support?
So you mean in terms of doing self-assessments within the agency? Molly, could you clarify? Or I can just offer some thoughts. I think
Sure.
in terms of I think what Susan's group has done is a great example of tapping into rubrics or assessment instruments to be able to borrow from standardized tools that have already been developed. So that's always a helpful place to start, is to determine where you can gain and borrow from other entities. And I was also going to suggest, Kelly, in terms of the Baltimore and New York work that you've done, I think in terms of us even supporting that resource sharing, if there's any materials out of those efforts, I think that's always a great place to start, is to learn where those activities have been done before, where groups have found it to be helpful and in which ways, and how those potentially could apply to your specific situation in space and time. So, and then obviously, to communicate with people that are identified experts in those areas. Often, I think people are surprised to see that while, yes, there's folks that do this as their job and so they make money doing this, but they often are totally willing to provide informal consultation, even just questions or point you in the direction of resources. So I think you should always try to tap into the people that are on these materials. We are here as resources to ask questions of, and we can help. This is an informal community of practice, but I think overall, this is how you sort of learn and gauge insights from others. And there already is a wealth of resources to at least get you on the journey, to get you started.
Mm-hmm. Others want to weigh into that on that before we go to the next question? Okay, we have one here that's really about trying to build buy-in for the evidence capacity assessment. How do you do that so that it generates sort of that positive energy, right, around the process, and moves away from some of the anxiety about compliance and auditing? Thoughts on that from folks?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a little bit of a crack on it. I think part of it is thinking about how this can be useful to the agency, to leadership. What is it that they want to do? What is their vision for the agency? And how can this capacity assessment focus on their priorities? And so that's always a good way to get leadership buy-in. I think another thing to do is focusing on things that are changeable, things that are malleable. Because if we find out that there's low capacity in an area over which we have no control, that's disheartening, honestly, because there's nothing we can do about it, or very little we can do about it. And so that's one of the things with the HHS capacity assessment. As we thought about which questions we wanted to ask, we didn't want to ask things that we already knew the answer to. So that would be a waste of time, and that's disheartening. And we didn't want to ask questions about things that we really have no way to control. So those are a couple of ideas that may help to build excitement, or at least engagement in the capacity assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I think also connecting back to the other question, when we are in, when we launch some of these larger engagements or these larger evidence planning initiatives, we do pull a coalition together up front of diverse stakeholders because they have to implement on the back end. And using that opportunity to also reposition certain team members who might have been like, oh, that's the evaluation person, that's the compliance person, as they're actually leading a new way, leading a new initiative that is exciting, and they are, you know, seen as the point people in really making things better. And so I think the language, resetting the culture around kind of key folks involved just goes an enormously long way. And promoting ownership, so it's not an exercise where folks are at the mercy. It's really being at the source and driving forward. And we've seen.
If I could just add to that for a minute. I think one way to think about that, how you generate buy-in and excitement, it shouldn't be just about the capacity assessment, but about the role of evaluation and evidence building in general. And that should be sort of an ongoing effort. One of the things that we did at the Labor Department, I don't know if Christina's still doing it or not, was annually we had what we called a customer survey, which was a survey to internal stakeholders in the program offices to get their perceptions of how well the evaluation office was doing in terms of relating to them, understanding their mission and objectives, showing high technical capability that they respected, and to get their ideas about what a high functioning evaluation office in their minds should be. And we used that every year, not only to assess where we were in terms of being relevant and responsive to our customers, the programs, but to building some of the areas that we may not have been 100% on. So we use that as a way to gauge how we should be improving. So I wouldn't view the buy-in of just the capacity assessment, but of the whole entity of evidence building.
Thanks for that, Demetra. Kind of in the same vein, Susan, I wanted to ask you, with the survey that you are administering, who are the respondents? Who is going to be sharing their perspectives on evidence capacity in the agency?
Mm-hmm. And there's still some flexibility. It's not entirely known exactly who's going to respond, but the council is going to give the survey to each of the members of the council. So there's at least one representative of each operating and staff division. Then within that operating and staff division, that particular council member will decide who's going to respond. ACL, Administration for Community Living, I believe is still the smallest operating division. And so in our case, I will be the person that's responding. I will touch base with some of the other partners that we have in the agency, but I will be responding. We're small. It's easy for us to do it that way. But if you think about a CMS, an NIH, a CDC, for example, there are a lot of different sub-agencies, bureaus, organizations that can do this. So it would be up to the particular representative that's on the council to make that decision. And so there are questions in the survey itself to find out who is responding, sort of what their position is, and are they responding for the whole operating or staff division, or are they responding for their particular office or center or bureau? So that's what we're looking at doing at this time.
Thank you for that. There's a lot of complexity there trying to figure out how to structure that. There's a question here a little bit about trying to understand how the results of the capacity assessments will be disseminated or used after they're completed by agencies. Are any of you familiar with whether the OMB will require or recommend action plans based on assessment results or other kinds of follow-up?
I believe that the idea is that there would be a capacity building plan that would come out of the capacity assessment, but I don't know that OMB has specifically said what that would be. I think that they are being flexible in all of these different areas in terms of what your learning agenda should look like, what your evaluation plan should look like, what your capacity assessment and capacity building plan should look like. But I believe that there is an expectation that there would be something that comes after the capacity assessment itself in terms of some sort of plan. And I believe that OMB has been saying that to the extent possible, all of these various different products should be made public.
Well, I can also add that as per the OMB guidance, there's materials in there. And Susan, you're so much better than I am at remembering the exact, can you hear the one that describes all of the dates, but they indicate the publishing dates for all of the evidence, the 3 requirements. So these will be publicly made available for all of the CFO Act agencies. And Susan.
M1923.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I know that a lot of you talked about the resource constraints and the difficulty in getting funding and time to do this work. That's so important. Can you share a little bit about how you've managed that in your own experience? How do you make time and resources when there aren't any?
Well, I'll jump in. I'll admit I don't have a great answer for it. I think, and this has limited applicability, honestly, but if we can get people to be excited about these things, they are more willing than you would think to participate in them. And so we do have to balance wanting to know a lot of information and wanting to not burden people so that we exhaust them and they are not willing to do these things. But I think if we can be transparent, and Demetra sort of alluded to that, of having these different types of surveys, having these capacity assessments and the other things that we're asking people to do, and then reporting back to them. What have we found? What are we going to do with it? Giving people updates. It takes a while then, but the next time we ask them to do something, they're going to be more likely to want to do it if they see that what they did the first time really resulted in something positive for the agency or positive for themselves personally, their office, you know, their budget, whatever that might be. But I think taking little small bites, asking small questions and having then some return for those individuals and those offices with those small things, then we can ask the next larger question and go from there, but always being mindful that we need to just ask the most important questions that we need to ask. And, you know, those of you who know me, I always say, if you ask something because it would be interesting to know it, you need to X that off of your survey right away. We only need to know what would be useful to know, what is actionable to know. And so making sure that we balance some of those things, I think, can help, but I don't have really a good answer for making sure that we can get that type of buy-in and those types of resources.
I think maybe building on that, and this is not a universal, but we have seen bright spots when there's more rigorous capacity assessment that sheds as much light on what needs to be built and new investments required as it does what needs to stop. Every piece of data costs money to collect. Collect too much stuff that we're not always using, and we have seen in a number of instances where new work can be funded out of operations because of a set of decisions to stop doing a set of things. It's not 100%, it's not in all cases, but it's enough, and that is a cost benefit of doing more systematic, more rigorous capacity building assessments. And I would say also we're beginning to see a little more pattern recognition, and I'm curious if fellow panelists sort of see some of the same things. Sometimes the better we get at data visualization has a knock-on effect of encouraging, igniting more insights, more questions, more curiosity, more ownership for the work. and faster ways to get it done, ways to automate some of, maybe what wasn't automated before, or shortcut ways to getting at answering some of those critical questions. And so I think we are seeing more of those types of opportunities playing out in organizations that do more of this rigorous work on the front end. And then they're also equally empowered to say, I'm sorry, these are just not things that we can do this year without budget. But these are priorities for when budget become available.
Yeah. Those are some great examples of dissemination. You have all stressed sort of the importance of closing the loop and showing people how data and evidence helps their own practice. Do you have any thoughts on other ways to build in sort of that complete feedback loop with all of the different kinds of sub-agencies and staff that are affected by this process?
I can offer for Department of Labor, one of the things that we focus on is having some commitment to the planning cycle, so that we have touch points that we have that are on an annual or biannual basis, but then we also have smaller topic focused or maybe sub-agency office focused evidence update activity. So I think as you get to know and work with your various stakeholders, you have the minimum engagement, and then there's more if there's sort of a bilateral interest. So again, I think there's always the part where you have to push out content, and that's really critical so that people at least are kept informed in terms of the information loop, but that you open yourself up to a more routine sort of ongoing conversation should that be an appetite for your partner. So there should be both the push and the pull kind of activities.
Mm-hmm.
Molly, maybe we can do one last question before we turn it over to Demetra to close us out.
Sure. We got a question here a little bit about how agencies can think about sustaining capacity within their organization so that there's sort of protection against turnover, right, in leadership or other staff. What are some strategies that agencies can use to make sure that those sorts of changes don't affect the overall sort of evidence culture that you're trying to build?
A couple of quick ideas really focus on institutionalizing that. And so having certain things, the mission of a particular office or the mission of a program, a bureau, something like that, having some language in that mission, the vision, the official statement related to these things can then carry forward even if staff change, even if administrations change, things like that. And so also perhaps putting some things in position descriptions for people that we're hiring for different positions across the agency that are relevant to this. Those are a couple of quick ways to think about institutionalizing this so that even if particular champions or individuals are not present in the future, those words can still live on.
Thank you.
Great.
Really
Christina, you want to dive in? Yep.
One last thing, it reinforces the fact that all of the CFO Act agencies now have to have evaluation policies posted publicly, and this is a really critical linchpin to creating institutional legacy. So I just want to also kind of piggyback on top of Susan's comment that is a really great opportunity with the Evidence Act to create these institutional legacies.
Yeah, I think that's a key point that actually circles back on something I mentioned previously that we've seen through our federal standard of excellence, where things like learning agendas or evaluation plans go from best practices, what the leaders are doing, to be required by all. That really sets a new baseline in terms of what an organization is responsible and accountable for as a department for doing that work. And so learning agendas, the capacity assessment itself, evaluation plans, evaluation policies, all those things the Evidence Act talks about, I think really sets a new baseline in terms of what the institution, the organization itself is responsible for, and not just the set of individuals that may be there at the moment. Obviously, the task, as we've discussed today, is how to inculcate that, how to create that culture, how to make it not the check the box activity, but really how do we use that to improve results, I think is the key part. And so with that, I really want to thank all of our panelists for today. I think we've had a really interesting and stimulating conversation. Thanks to Molly for facilitating that great Q&A, to Demetra and the whole Urban Institute team for hosting us today. I hope that each of you feels a little bit better equipped to examine your agency's research, evaluation, statistical, and analysis capacity as a way to make improvements. I think Demetra offered, Susan offered, I think I'll offer on behalf of the other panelists as well. If folks would like to follow up with us, we can certainly help you to do that. I think probably the easiest way, and Demetra or Ivy, you can jump in the chat there, is probably just to respond to some of the emails you've gotten for the RSVPs, to be able to do that, or to Demetra directly, and she can help direct some of those conversations. But I want to thank you all again today for joining. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to turn it back to Demetra for some closing thoughts. Demetra?
Thank you, Jed. I think we heard a lot, and I just also want to say that the presentation and the PowerPoints will be on the Urban Institute's capacity website and evidence capacity website, and you'll get a notice about that, everybody who registered. And there are some reports in there that you might particularly want to look at, including one that I think Molly and I did, which was on ways to build and strengthen a culture of evidence and evaluation within your agencies. So that I think would be critical. Also, again, this is part of the Urban Institute's Federal Evidence Forum. We do have some remaining resources from our funders, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the William T. Grant Foundation, to provide some targeted assistance when we can to individual agencies if you request us. So let me know if a little bit of time might help you. And thanks especially to Jed and the Results for America team, to all of our panelists. And on behalf of the Urban Institute, we are very glad to have you here, and look for emails coming soon, and please get in touch with us if there are other topics or issues on evidence building and evaluation that you would like us to address, either through federal only workshops like this one or through public events. Thank you for coming today, and have a good day and stay safe. Thank you.